doesn't tell you that it's got to do a lot with the patriarchy. It doesn't tell you that the avenues of discourse are not positive towards women. What he tells you is that India's daughter provides like statistical analysis about why people rape, or why we have to humanize them. But we tell you that government methods of controlling the population only occur when the negative discourse is beyond the scope of their control, but also when it distracts from positive discourse. So what he didn't analyze is what happens when you release controversial media to an incredibly inflamed and emotional society who isn't acting in positive interest. Maybe you should have read the info slide, because the reaction of the Indian public to this video was to go out and stigmatize women for dressing indecently. The discourse wasn't centered around whether women are constructive and positive agents in society. It was about whether or not women dressing indecently deserve it. That was the discourse we got. We had people going on mad hunts for rapists because you don't humanize the victims. You don't provide the critical analysis in that video either. All you do is you present an incredibly inflated context to the media that the society then latches onto and deals with incredibly negatively. But what is the harm in today's debate, and we feel like they've sidelined this, is that they don't end up going to the women's forums. They don't end up engaging in critical societal discourse. What they end up doing is going into the slums of India and beating the supposed rapists with rocks. What they end up saying, what they end up promulgating are misogynist statements like, well, the rapist has a point, she dressed indecently, she deserves it. The rapist defending rape is something we don't want in an Indian society because the audience doesn't have the capacity to humanize the woman in this context. That's why we ban the media, and that's why we're proud to not regret the ban when it's set. So when it comes to rape in India, we don't think it has to do with the fact that we have no idea why people rape. It has to do with the patriarchy. It has to do with the fact that misogynist audiences are incredibly rife in India, and the perpetuation of this occurs when you have that negative discourse, when you erode the control of the state, when you have people going out and being vigilante heroes, when you break the rule of law. It becomes incredibly difficult to enforce penalties on the actual rapists that you catch, okay? Because people got there before you, and now it's just a debacle for the Indian government to deal with the scope of control that they lack. We don't think that it humanizes victims either. All it does is creates a negative platform for discourse that distracts from the positive influences of society. People aren't willing to go and support the women's movement in India because they think that flinging rocks at the rapist is enough, because that's a societal reaction that we get. That's why we banned it, because we don't see a continuance of something positive. We would see a continuance of the violence, a continuance of the negative discourse that then detracts from the positive scope of the debate. So we don't think it's about humanizing rapists or humanizing the woman either, because an incredibly superfluous view presented in the video. But even if they did go into that critical analysis, we think that the audience is unwilling to engage in that because of the emotional nature and the context or the contextualization of these statements. When you have people saying things like, when a woman dresses indecently, they deserve it, the debate isn't about whether or not rape is wrong or we need to undermine the patriarchy in India. It's whether or not when a woman dresses a certain way, if she asks for it when she does that, and what is the platform to deal with these rapists. We don't get constructive questions being asked, but we get a negative backlash that lends itself towards societal violence and the breakdown of order. So that's what we tell you in today's debate as opening opposition. We're going to tell you that the current situation in India with regards to rape has progressed beyond the scope of governmental control, but the only way to bring it back to the center, bring it back towards order, is when you enforce public policy and mechanisms of discourse that facilitate positive progression and the image of women in society, okay? So we don't think that when you have an ungovernable populace, a populace that reacts incredibly violently towards a video, that you can rationally negotiate towards them, okay? We think that victims of xenophobia and xenophobia in general lacks contextual understanding, but the reason that people go out with pangas and massacre the Malawians is because they have a conflated idea of what they are doing in our country and who they really are. But when it comes towards the promulgation of media that exacerbates xenophobia, it doesn't help them either, because they're only willing to understand and receive certain messages from that video. They're only willing to recognize messages that contribute towards violence and the breakdown of order. We tell you that even if there is a reception towards this video, if there is some form of humanization, people are unwilling to hear it, and that's why they were massacring people in the slums. That's why the debate was about whether or not women dressing indecently was something that they asked for it. And that's one thing that the nature of this media is something we would sense as a state. We're going to tell you that in a particular context, the justification for rape given by the rapist is something that became central towards society and ended up hijacking the constructive debate that they had. We think that the women's movement in India was stifled by the not premise that Indian men in society are fronting this idea that when women dress indecently, that women can ask for rape and that women can deserve to be raped in certain instances. We tell you that that becomes the avenue of discourse, that and the violence in the slums. They are unwilling to positively progress the discussion quickly.
In a state where people have systematically failed to protect women from rape, when most rapists go free, do you not think that actually this vigilantism is a hell of a
Well,
lot better
we think
than
that the method of controlling rape in India, when it comes to governmental control, relies on public participation in women's movements, but also public discussion in constructive debate. Now, I've told you how we managed to hijack that debate, how we managed to make it all about the violence and all about how women can ask for rape instead of addressing a particular context. And that's why the Indian government banned the material in the first place, because having an ungovernable populace, having the ability or the ineffectuality to impose the rule of law on these rapists is something we don't have. When you get vigilante heroes thinking that justice has been enacted, when people are unwilling to participate in the mechanisms of the state that allow for discourse, you detract from the positive debate, you make it about beating women in slums. That's what David Harris is telling you, that it's better to have this vigilante justice. We think that's balderdash. What we need in India is a positive discussion, because that's the only way you excise the demons of society, when people are willing to come to a table and talk about it and not fling rocks at the end. So that's the nature of the social discourse that we see. That's the reason we ban it. I'm talking why we have the governmental censorship, and why people be acting beyond the scope of governmental control doesn't necessarily help the position of women, because it distracts from the nature of positive social discourse. People in the slums who are willing to become vigilante heroes in this context, people who are willing to make misogynist statements because they think they can defend the rapists, are unwilling to participate in the women's movement in India, unwilling to go to public forums or public debates. We think that that's the genesis for social change. We think that when you distract from this, when you make it about the violence, you make it about India's daughter instead of the daughters in India, you make it less about the positive discourse and far more about the negative. But also I've told you about why the societal platform has a limited scope of attention, and how this negative discourse crowds out any positive and constructive views, because the nature of this inflamed and patriarchal society is to go and enact the violence, is to go and make misogynistic statements. They're incredibly receptive towards that, but we think the only way it changes is when you remove the conflated media, when you remove the genesis of their discontent, and you start to have positive and constructive discourse around it. We think that women are also more inclusive and included in this, because under your model of vigilante justice, it's all about the men and how they view women, but also about how men react to rape. We don't think you cater for women who want to react to rape, because the forms that they're going to are intended by the men. Thank you.